Good morning to our participants in the United States. Good afternoon to Europe and good evening to Asia. Welcome to the latest in our series of Asia Times webinars. I'm David Goldman, Asia Times Deputy Editor, and I'm honored and delighted to be speaking today to the ultimate guru of America's high-tech industry, Dr. Handel Jones, the Chief Executive Officer of International Business Strategies. I can tell you firsthand that among industry insiders, venture capitalists, Silicon Valley CEOs, Handel Jones is viewed as an indispensable source of information and wisdom about the state of the industry. We're thrilled to have him, and he's speaking to us appropriately from Silicon Valley in California. So Dr. Jones, welcome and many thanks for taking the time to speak to us today.
Thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be meeting with you again, and also hopefully I can give you some useful information and also the audience.
Well, let's dive right in. The topic of our webinar today is what happens when China strikes back. Those of us who look at the Chinese stock market have noticed that some of the main tech indices are down by nearly 25% from their peaks, and surely one part of that is the rumor of possible delisting of Chinese stocks from American exchanges. The Commerce Department indicated that there would be no change in the Trump tariffs. The entity list, which forbids American companies from selling high-end chips to Huawei and ZTE and other Chinese companies, remains in place. There are reports of tech restrictions spilling into China's aerospace program. So from what we can see, the American position really has not changed in any way since the change of administrations. Is my impression as an outsider correct that the Biden administration is taking a very tough stance towards China in terms of tech transfer?
Yes, you're correct. The Biden administration has not relaxed any of the restraints or constraints on China. In fact, additional constraints are being brought in. The difference, though, right now, from what we can see, is that even though the Alaska meeting had some volatility to it, there seems to be a more rational approach. And I think there'll be less big surprises going forward. But the issue that we have is that a fairly high percentage of Americans consider China to be an enemy. And the basis for being an enemy is not well defined. I mean, we certainly have the economic competition. Do we have military competition today? Maybe not on our shores, but I don't know if you consider the South China Sea as being an area of potential military confrontation. There's also the open issue of Taiwan. But yeah, I think the Biden administration is trying to increase the pressure on China. What we don't understand is what is the long game of the US? What does the US hope to gain out of this? So obviously part of it is to slow down high technology development adoption in China. But what we see though in 2021 is a very different China from 2020. And we can give you some examples of where that's occurring. So in 2020, it seemed that China was kind of bending at each action the US took, whether it was rational, irrational, etc. But in 2021, it's a radically different situation. And so that actually can result in high level of conflict. And we think the US will respond with probably more restraints. China will then come back with its activities. But the key here is we can analyze what's happening today, but the key issue is also what's going to happen long term. Where's China going? Where's the US going? Is there a gap opening up between US and China? Is the gap closing? So do we have a good strategy in the US? Do we have a good policy in the US? And then, of course, we can talk about what some of the actions China we think will take in 2021.
Well, Dr. Jones, before my next question, I'd like to remind participants that you can use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen to submit questions. We will be giving audience questions to Dr. Jones a bit later, so please think of them and do write them down. Now, as you said, everyone's trying to understand what the U.S. long game is. If you read the report that Eric Schmidt and Robert Ork put together for the National Security Council for Artificial Intelligence, it says quite explicitly that the United States should use tech restrictions on semiconductor manufacturing equipment and so forth to stop China's rise as a tech power. So I have a two-part question. Is that American policy? And secondly, to what extent will it work? How much can the United States hurt China? How much can the United States slow China down?
So when we look at the activities of China in microelectronics, we have record design activities of new products in 2021. And when you look at the activities of high silicon, which are effectively closed right now, they did the Kirin 9000, which is the chipset for their smartphone, and that is comparable to anything that Qualcomm can do, anything that Apple can do. So that is world class. But where was it manufactured? It was manufactured with TSMC. The design activities in China in advanced technologies right now are concentrated both in TSMC and in Samsung.
In Taiwan and Korea.
Yes, exactly. So from a design perspective, China is racing ahead, and artificial intelligence, domination in artificial intelligence industries is one of their goals. And as long as they have access to TSMC and Samsung, they can achieve that goal. Blocking SMIC has really no impact because SMIC is less than 5% of the foundry market. Their best technology could be argued to be 12 or maybe 14 nanometers. And that's not where the design activities of new products are. So I think US activities in trying to slow down China in terms of microelectronics will not be effective as number one, there's access to TSMC and Samsung. And number two, there's access to the EDA tools from Cadence, Synopsys, Mentor, Siemens, and Ansys. So China is racing ahead. And as I mentioned, there are a record number of designs in 2021. And of course, the design engineers that were at high silicon are probably about 10,000 highly skilled engineers. They're not out of a job. They basically are still designing chips.
Let me try to drill down here, because the United States has asserted extraterritorial power. If you use American intellectual property, if you use an American-built machine, then the United States says it has the right to tell you whether or not you can sell a chip to China. To what extent can the United States prevent Taiwan and Korea from making chips for China? And again, how much does that hurt China?
That's an interesting question, because so far, even though there are some companies on the entity list, as you know, ZTE paid a fine. So ZTE is now able to buy chips. Huawei is not. So ZTE is able to build base stations at a slower rate, 5G bases, slower rate than before. But there are some activities there. You know, I'm not an attorney, so I'm not going to claim the right to determine whether the U.S. has a legal position. But so far, to a certain extent, it has worked. But Samsung has a big facility in Xi'an making 3D NAND. They bought some land to make batteries in Xi'an, right next to the existing facility. SK Hynix has a fab in Wuxi, and they're expanding it to make DRAM. So right now, the ability of the companies not on the entity list to access semiconductors is fairly open. And for Samsung, China is a very important market. For SK Hynix, it's an important market. Even Infineon from Germany is a very important market because Germany also wants to sell automobiles into China. So it's a very mixed environment, and the benefit to the US so far, frankly, has been fairly minimal.
Now, from China's standpoint, China feels this is unfair and prejudicial. What might China do to retaliate against the United States? And here I'm asking you to speculate. Obviously, the Chinese will decide what they're going to do, but what are our vulnerabilities with respect to prospective Chinese restrictions, and what might the Chinese implement by way of response?
So early indicators are that China now regards the China market as a China asset. And you see that right now within the cotton arena, where H&M is effectively being blocked from the China market. And the Chinese are saying, if you are going to say negative things about us, don't think about participating in our market. So how China will start addressing or controlling its market, this is a clear threat coming out of China right now. This is one area that we can control, and it's not going to be necessarily open to you if you view us as an enemy or a challenge. And the other one is China exports. I think in Alaska, one of their people said, we don't need the US. Well, they do. But in terms of how they manage exports, and of course there are some exports like the rare earth materials where the US is highly dependent. So they can also start managing exports in terms of what they're willing to sell to us. Another area is the manufacturing in China. People talk about, well, we go to Vietnam, we go to India and so on. Well, China's putting in highly automated factories. Now, of course, that includes Foxconn Honhai, which is basically based in headquartered in Taiwan. But the manufacturing supply chain in China for high technology is very important. So Apple is going to India. Right now, it's mainly for smartphones from India. But India doesn't have the full supply chain because you need all the components, you need the logistics and so on. So the automated facilities for manufacturing in China are becoming very high tech. And the other one is IP. If you look at IP in 5G, China has a strong position. So they could start exerting that in terms of blocking potentially Ericsson, blocking potentially Nokia, blocking potentially probably not Samsung, but also Qualcomm. That's another area they can apply pressure. And of course, the other one is the external pressure from a political point of view, which I don't want to get into too much. But the activities in terms of building relations with other countries, they just signing an agreement with Iran, basically with Russia, basically building up a secondary or a competitive political trade environment. And David, you pointed out very astutely the SWIFT agreement for digital currency. So there are about five or six we named steps they can take, in addition, of course, to potentially trying to do something about Taiwan.
There is a lot of speculation about America's dependency on rare earth minerals from China. If you ask most think tankers or policy people, the first item that will come up in terms of prospective Chinese economic pressure in the US would be rare earths. You haven't mentioned it. Do you think that's probably outside the scope of play in this situation?
I think there are two ways of addressing some of those key capabilities. One is to have slow pressure, which could be raising prices, maybe restricting quantities, not blocking, but restricting things. But that's one area. Many of the chemicals we have for our pharmaceutical industries come from China. So again, they can take the boil and the frog approach, where they gradually raise the stakes. But the difference, though, this year from last year is that China is becoming more vocal in its response to the US. And so, in addition to doing things that actually can start hurting us, I think that they'll be also more outward in terms of their resistance to the US. You know, again, they said, well, we don't need the US. That's not true. I mean, they do need the US, but the US also needs China. I mean, the imports this year, as you mentioned in one of your talks, David, will be a record. So US consumers are very heavily dependent on China. US corporations are very heavily dependent on China for sub-assemblies and so on. So US companies are very dependent on China for the China market. So if you look at the smartphone market this year, probably about 70, if you take out Apple and you take out Samsung, 90% of the 5G smartphones would be from Chinese companies. 90% 5G smartphones. So that means Qualcomm needs the China market. Qorvo needs China market. Skyworks needs China market. Many US companies need the China market, both in not only in high tech, but in other industries. So it's a highly dependent economic ecosystem right now. And so how that gets pressured going forward, I think China has many options. US has some options too. But the key thing is, what's your long-term plan? So Eric Schmidt and so on, and the other person, they identified AI as the long goal and the long-term goal. And that's a very, very key aspect of high technology, but also economic power and political power.
Well, let's talk for a second about the U.S. long-term plan. This morning, the Biden administration proposed a $2 trillion spending program for everything from roads and bridges to elder and disability care to manufacturing support and research and development. From the first reports I've seen, the R&D component of this in an 8-year plan is a proposed $180 billion. So, $23, $24 billion a year. Now, considering that under the Carter administration and the Reagan administration, the United States spent nearly an additional percentage point of gross domestic product on R&D, on federal R&D, more than it does now. So, 220, 230 billion. The Biden administration's R&D commitment looks, from first reports, very tepid to me. Is my impression correct, or am I giving you an unfair question about something which has just appeared in the papers?
Well, I think one of the points that the Biden administration has said regarding China, regarding competing with China, is that we do have to build an infrastructure system. And, if you look at the high-speed trains in China, basically we're now talking about 600 kilometers an hour between Beijing and Shanghai, Chengdu and Guangzhou, basically those 4 areas. So we're talking 600 kilometers an hour. And the high-speed train system is very effective. They're building new airports. What we're talking about is repairing a lot of what we have. And a big part of Biden's administration and his new appointee mentioned this, a key part of dealing with China is that we have to build the ability to hire more US workers. So the infrastructure is ability to hire US workers. So to protect and build the US workers. But to me, what they should be focusing is corporations. It's corporations that do the innovation. It's corporations that actually hire the key people or hire people. And it's corporations that basically allow you to compete in global markets. So the infrastructure is a good thing. It's a good thing to get votes. It's a good thing we need it. The infrastructure we have is terrible, but it will not really move the needle against China. We can't build a high-speed train between San Diego and San Francisco. So again, I think the infrastructure idea is good, and we're spending a lot of money on infrastructure and other things. And of course, we have to figure out how to pay for that in the future. But that does not give a strategy of how to compete with China. that does not, you're right. Basically, before, we had Bell Labs, which was a superb area of R&D. I was involved with Rockwell in terms of some of the R&D there, the CDMA, which is basically now very, very well commercialized or very well improved by Qualcomm. Some of that started in Rockwell, but we also had the Park Laboratories. We had the Watson Labs. Our R&D in many areas has gone down significantly. So I think we're doing some of the right things, but again, we don't have a vision of what we're going to look like in 2030, 2040 from a competitiveness point of view against China.
This is my concern, Dr. Jones. If the United States doesn't have a strategy, well, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. I'm worried about improvisation, trial and error in terms of technology policy towards China in a way that sends mixed signals and ultimately invites a very tough retaliatory response from the other side.
Yeah, so I think if you look at where some of the long-term growth opportunities will come from, obviously semiconductors is one area. We have a market of $1.13 trillion in 2030 now. $1.13 trillion. It goes up 2.5x, 2.6x from 2020. One area that we're tracking is semiconductor consumption per person. And a metric for you back in 2010, semiconductor consumption per person in China was about $18, 818. In 2020, semiconductor consumption per person in China was $85. Went up about,
So $2.3 trillion. That just
so 1.13 trillion. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, 1.3 trillion. So a remarkable sum. I'm sorry, I interrupted. Go on, please.
Yeah. So in 2030, China will be about $200 consumption, semiconductor consumption per person. So we're now starting to track India. India is going to have very strong growth in semiconductor consumption per person. So that's one metric in terms of the importance of semiconductor industry. In 2030, though, 60% of the semiconductor market will be in China. 60%. And if you were to look at the consumption of semiconductors in China, back in about 2005, 2006, about 12% was consumed by Chinese companies. About 88% was exported in terms of products from personal computers, smartphones went around and so on, contract manufacturing. In 2020, Chinese companies, the smartphone companies, then now consume about 52% of consumption in China. In 2030, it'll be about 70%. So, and that's because of the increase or strengthening in smartphones, in a whole range of industries, automobile industries, and so on. So the growth of semiconductors in the US will also be as positive. And of course, we have many of the same patterns in the US, but China is moving faster. So by having that large market, that gives them also huge power in dominating who they work with.
We have some listener questions coming in, and we'll get to them in just a few minutes. But I'd like to, since we have the privilege of having Dr. Jones with us, I'd like to ask two big questions. The first is, how soon would you anticipate China will be able to be a significant force in semiconductor fabrication? They've made that a major national priority. It's obviously very hard to do. It's a long-term project. How long will that take them? And the second question is, with all of the Chinese investment in the downstream applications of 5G, the robotics, the mining, the telemedicine, the smart cities, mechanized agriculture, digital agriculture, how do you see those downstream applications affecting the growth and productivity of the Chinese economy between now and 2030?
So we spend a lot of time tracking the activities of Chinese companies within the semiconductor manufacturing equipment. And companies like AMEC and so on are making some progress. But we don't think that in the next 8 years, 10 years, there will be significant factors in advanced technologies. We study applied materials, we study LAM, we study KLA, we study TEL, we study ASML. And from the advanced technology point of view, they're not going to really have any significant impact. So US companies, European companies, Japanese companies within the advanced technologies will have a big impact. Now, there's a big market for the mature technologies, what we view as 28 nanometers. And there they can actually have a significant impact. But they need a complete set of tools. So having one piece of tooling doesn't really help you very much. Stuff has to be integrated. But from a semiconductor equipment manufacturing point of view, based on the complexity of both the hardware and now the increasing complexity of software, no significant progress in the next 10 years. The other issue, or maybe 8 years, the other issue is there's no market in China for that equipment. SMIC, basically, they're stopped at 12. So they're not going to buy any 5 nanometer tooling. Samsung has none in Xi'an. They're not going to buy tooling from Chinese companies. They want the best. Same with SK Hynix. So even though they can develop some equipment, and we actually know the government people fairly well, and we know the funding, there's no market. So TSMC is not going to buy. So Intel's not going to buy. So yeah, there's no market. So from that point of view, again, it's probably 8 years minimum, 10 years. We don't see any real progress. We don't see the closing of the gap. Let's put it that way. EDA is different, by the way.
Let me be devil's advocate here for a second. Let's say that I'm, some China hawk in the national security establishment. And I say, well, I've just heard you, Dr. Jones, saying the Chinese really can't develop their own fabrication equipment. So what if we Americans put on a full court press to stop them from obtaining high-end semiconductors and manufacturing equipment and so forth, and really try to tie them down for the next 10 years, slow them down while we figure out how to get our act together? I hear people talk this way. What would your response be?
Well, high technology is a key part of the growth of China. And obviously, high technology includes electronics and also the medical field, a whole range of things. So that will involve a strong response from China. And I think that kind of strong activity, both sides, hopefully we can avoid, because that's going to be very dangerous, because we can be hurt significantly as well as hurting China. Our solution is, frankly, to accelerate technology development in the US. We have the brain power. We have excellent people here, but we're being held back in some ways in terms of what we view as the political environment. Google, I think, is a national asset. Amazon is a national asset. Facebook is a national asset. Now, of course, some people in Washington want to break them up. Well, they have overstepped some of the things they should do, but they're a treasure. The number of people they employ, and of course, the number of smart people they employ is a key significant asset for the US. So you also asked another question. We view robotics as one of the key capabilities going forward. Robots used in factories today. They're being used in surgery. They're being used in logistics. Autonomous vehicles are robots on wheels. So the activities in China in robots is very, very active. Many companies. And as you know, in China, when many companies are in a market, there are big losses, there are winners, there are losers. But robots is going to be a huge industry in future. Robots for the home care of the aged. Drones are flying robots. So that's one area where AI becomes increasingly important. And of course, drones, robots, and so on will also be important in the military field. So that is one area where AI And the hardware capabilities are going to be very important for many industries. And again, we're not putting in the money in those areas that give us what we call the jump ahead in technology. If you follow somebody else, you can almost never close the gap. So you have to take the jump ahead technology concept, and that's what China has done with high-speed trains. That's what they're doing. That's what they've done in 5G. And I think and of course, right now they're doing in robots. Leadership in robots is in Japan. But in terms of investment, probably 100x investment in China, everywhere else combined. So that's part of the future where you're going to see robots and also all sorts of automation that puts China in a very strong position. And of course, China now has to find jobs for the people that work in factories. They find jobs for their drivers. So that's part of their new education system.
At this point, we'll start going to questions from our audience. Let me interject briefly a word from our sponsor. Asia Times relies on subscriptions to be able to bring you events like this, and of course, our 24-hour-a-day global coverage of world events. So please, if you haven't subscribed to Asia Times, please do so. You can find the link on the website. We're very grateful for your support. And with that, I'd like to start with a question from a listener who asks, what kind of role does Europe play in the tech war between China and the United States? That's a real easy question.
Well, if you look at some of the activities in China, electric vehicles is one area where China is putting in big investments. We have in 2030 a total of globally 31 million electric vehicles. China will produce about 20 million. So this is a huge market for Volkswagen. This is a big market now for BMW and so on. So the automobile industry, the automobile market in China is very important for Germany. So we do see some resistance to US pressure in Germany, not very outwardly, but that's one of the key parts of the German strategy towards China. France, ST, is actually doing quite well in a number of areas in China. ST, microelectronics, is actually a leader in the silicon carbide for electric vehicles, and Tesla is the biggest customer now. They've also announced that BYD is a customer, but they also do things like time of flight, facial recognition for the smartphones. So China is also a very important market for automobile industry of France and other industries of France. So we do see the potential for divergence between the US and Europe. And of course, Europe has a market size similar to the US. Europe is not really one country. The UK obviously is taking a completely different approach, but the UK industrial strength is weakening. So again, I think you're going to see closer relationships between Europe and China. In some areas, the relationships are very important for both regions. So I don't think you're going to see the lockstep support of the US going forward from European companies, because China is A, a big market, and B, is a big trading partner.
There's a question about India. It's been widely speculated that because of American interest in removing supply chains from China or reducing its dependency on Chinese supply chains, that India might be a tech manufacturing hub of the future to compete seriously with China. How realistic do you think those ambitions are for India?
You know, that's a very interesting question, because actually I've set up a factory in India and it was marginally successful. The Apple is actually producing smartphones in India. There are basically the equipment is being brought in from the outside, and supply chains are being brought in from the outside. And there's a growing market in India for smartphones. So that could be basically the beginning of some participation by India in the electronics industry. Electric vehicles, we think, would be very important for India. And and Tesla is planning to put a factory in India. So I think you'll see electric vehicles be coming up in India. The thing that's interesting in India, for India, by the way, if you visit Silicon Valley, many, and also in high-tech industry, many of the top people are from India. They're brilliant. And I think India has a very strong pool of talented people, and whether they use that pool for automated manufacturing, whether they use that pool for software. AI obviously is a big issue. Micron is putting a building or center in Hyderabad right now for AI for the memory business. So we see the role of India clearly increasing because they have the talent. The other side of the coin is why are we giving H-1B visa applications from India a hard time? I mean, as I said, if you look at the heads of many companies and also the supporting people, the breadth of capabilities from India is incredible. It's very impressive. In fact, I wish somebody would write a book on how Indians have impacted the US high-tech industry. Maybe that's something for you to do, David, because their performance. So India has this inherent market, they have this inherent capability, but they do have to make a lot of changes in how they allow foreign companies to operate in India.
Here is a question which I think you've answered before, but I'll repeat it because it comes from Alberto Reduano, one of our listeners. Is it possible to build a 7-nanometer chip fabrication plant without U.S. technologies?
No. And it's an emphatic no, because you really can't even build today a 28-nanometer factory without US technologies. So 7 nanometers doesn't need EUV, but again, you need some very good etching equipment, deposition equipment. That's only available from Applied Materials, Lam, TEL. No, it's not possible. And you know, even if you take some equipment that SMIC has that can support 12 and move that to 7, it's still going to be very difficult because the precision of what you have to do, you know, today 1 billion transistors at 7 nanometers costs about $2. 1 billion transistors. So if you have your own equipment and 1 billion transistors cost you $5, why not use 16 or why not use something else? Because cost is, I mean, there's also performance, there's also power consumption, but cost is, you know, it's not even close today.
I know this is something of an unfair question because you're not a strategic military analyst, and we will, in the near future, have a number of such people available to answer such questions. But one of our listeners points out that the issue of Taiwan's dominance in chip fabrication gets intermingled with Taiwan's strategic position and Chinese sensitivities, the one China policy and so forth. Do you see the economic or the technological importance of Taiwan spilling over into the strategic issues over Taiwan's relationship to the mainland?
You know, the pretty much every company that we talk to is concerned with this issue. What kind of constraints, what can China, mainland China do regarding limiting some activities in Taiwan? And this is one reason that Intel is now investing $20 billion as the first step to build 2 fab lines in Arizona, so that we are not that dependent, or we can reduce our dependence on TSMC and other companies in Taiwan. The reality is that TSMC in 2025 will be a $100 billion company, And the impact of the Intel investment will not be that significant from an overall wafer supply perspective. And of course, there's still a significant technology gap between Intel and TSMC, which Intel is hoping to close. We do have Samsung. Basically, Samsung is now investing significantly in the foundry business. And of course, in DRAM, they're number one. In NAND, they're number one. But yeah, it's every company we talk to is really concerned about what's going to happen in terms of the relationship between mainland China and Taiwan. And one of the issues is that the Chinese semiconductor companies, the fabless companies, are heavily dependent on Taiwan. Heavily dependent on Taiwan. So if there are any restrictions put by US on additional sales of wafers and advanced technologies to Taiwanese companies, expanding the entity list, for example, that can have a big impact on China. And again, the issue that we see again is, yeah, you can have a big impact on China, but in 2021, China will respond. So now we have to balance, or we have to figure out how strong that response will be. And frankly, that's a very difficult area to predict. We gave you some of the areas they can impact, but how fast they will do it, how strong they will do it. But that's every company we talk to is very concerned about that issue. And basically, there's no short-term solution.
Here's another really difficult question from a listener. Why do we have a global chip shortage now, and how long will it last?
That's an area we also spend a lot of time in. There are various reasons. One is the growth of the 5G smartphones. Wireless communications represents about 40% of the semiconductor consumption. You hear a lot about the automobile industry. Automobiles represents about 9%, a fairly small percentage of the total. But the growth of 5G smartphones increases demand this year about 23%. The work from home patterns has increased the demand for personal computers, notebook computers, and so on. Also televisions for entertainment. That has had a ripple through effect in terms of increased demand in data centers, servers. So this is the Google, this is the Amazons, this is the Cisco's, this is the Dells, and so on. And then the automobile industry. Automobile industry basically went into a big downturn. They cut orders. Microcontrollers is the number one product. They cut orders. The microcontroller companies like ST, Infineon, Microchip, they found other customers for those microcontrollers. So when the automobile market turned around, capacity was already filled. So we basically see that through the rest of this year, unless we have some kind of huge economic turbulence, we'll have shortages. We've also projected long-term demand. So as I mentioned, if the semiconductor market would be $1.13 trillion in 2030, it grows 2.6 times. The capacity, the value of the capacity has to grow 2.6 times. So CapEx this year for the industry is around 127 billion. In 2030, we're talking about 230 billion to 250 billion. So we see significant segments having shortages now for the next few years. And now there will be volatility. Basically, you're going to have an up and down. But DRAM demand is strong and shortages. NAND demand is strong and shortages. Foundry demand, TSMC, Global Foundries, UMC, everyone sold out. And basically, it's the, as I mentioned earlier, the growth of semiconductor per person is one of the factors that's also driving the total growth of the market. And right now, we have the US, we have Europe, we have China, but India is going to come in as a big market in growth of semiconductor per person, and smartphones will be one of the key volume drivers for that. Now, we're going to have shortages for quite a while, some phases of overcapacity, some volatility, but I think we have to make big investments in not only advanced technologies, but mature technologies, 28 nanometers, 40 nanometers. even for silicon carbide in 150 millimeters. That's going to be a huge growth market.
We have a couple of questions about China's investment model, which obviously has had mixed results. On the one hand, they have an incredible network of fast trains and infrastructure that makes us sometimes look like a third world country, and some huge accomplishments in industry. On the other hand, they also subsidize some older industries, and their rate of return on investment in aggregate has not been terrific. How do you see the China investment model developing? We hear enormous numbers about tech and R&D commitments from the Chinese government. How are they doing, and how will they do in the future, do you think?
Well, we see investments obviously increasing, and there are 2 or 3 reasons for that. They want to build a modern society. They want to build what we call a big data society. And they are graduating 7, 8 million graduates a year. They're putting a lot of emphasis on technology and the computer skills, math skills, and so on. So they have to find jobs for them. And so as long as the economy in China has positive growth, they're estimating 6% plus this year, I think the overall environment in China is where people are relatively satisfied. We're not going to talk about every group and so on, but I think in terms of the mainstream people, they're fairly satisfied. But they have to keep investing. And so if you are a government, you make decisions of where you spend money. So US government spends a lot of money. China government spends a lot of money. We make decisions of where we spend the money, and they make decisions of where they spend the money. And so the social environment, social spending in China is not that huge. But the investment right now in telemedicine in the health industry is huge. And of course, the high-speed trains, that's basically another area where they've put big investments. But the areas that we think will be important for them longer term are those, as I said, related to AI. They've been quite quiet about AI, but your smartphone, the picture taking capabilities on your smartphone, AI. 3D facial recognition, AI. Autonomous driving, AI. Robots, AI. So that's the underlying theme. And what do you need to build the employment? What do you need to build the new industries? And of course, they have to continue to be highly export oriented. So yeah, we see spending continuing. Yeah, if the return on investment goes down, so be it. It's not the metric that we would apply to investment in a corporation. Government payback metrics are quite different from corporations. And if you look at the US government investment payback, I don't think we should be too proud of it. We're spending $1.9 trillion, and how much of that will go to semiconductors? How much will that go to high tech? How much of that will go to 5G? How much of that will go to the future? So we're spending money, and we're making decisions on where we spend money. So to a certain extent, I think it's hypocritical that we criticize China on how it subsidizes its industries, because we can do the same thing if we want to. And it's a choice that we make in terms of where we spend money.
And segueing into another couple of listener questions. When the Trump administration considered the tech restrictions, the entity list restrictions on exports to China, US tech companies objected that this would reduce their revenues and reduce their R&D and ultimately reduce their competitiveness. Has this happened? Is it likely to happen? And will government spending on R&D or subsidies compensate for that in any way?
Well, if you look at specific areas like smartphones, Huawei was doing about 220 million smartphones. And Honor brand this year will do maybe 60 million, 90 million. But Xiaomi is growing. Xiaomi, Oppo, and Vivo, the 3 of them this year, are planning to ship 560 million smartphones. So the position of Huawei has been taken up by other Chinese companies. LG is thinking about getting out of smartphone business. So Apple actually has grown a little bit, not much, but the real impact in terms of the semiconductor demand, in terms of the demand for components from U.S. companies, hasn't been reduced significantly. 5G infrastructure is a slightly different situation where Huawei has pretty much been stopped. They still have some inventory. ZTE is now being given support. ZTE paid the fine, so they're not on the entity list, so they can buy components. So it's had mixed results. High-K Vision, basically, they're still booming in terms of their industry. So I don't think it's been gloom and doom for some U.S. companies as time has moved. But again, it hasn't really accomplished much in terms of China. I mean, they still dominate the smartphone market. 5G, as I said, is being slowed. That's something that's going to come to a head probably sometime later this year, maybe even the second quarter, where China will probably take some actions to try and open up supply to Huawei for acceleration or for bringing the 5G roadmap back to what it was before.
One of our viewers asks about China's Belt and Road initiative in the context of its high-tech investments. Apropos of that, I read this morning a report in Cumhuriyet, the leading Turkish daily, about Chinese investment in Turkey, pointing out that Turkey's smartphone penetration was among the highest in the world, which made Turkey ripe for e-commerce, e-finance, and many other applications which have become popular in China. And it was speculated that this would be an important area for Chinese investment and penetration of the Turkish economy. Do you have a sense of how China's Belt and Road Initiative, its expansion to the world, fits into this?
Yeah, it's we're tracking it to a certain extent. It's obviously very ambitious, but fairly mixed success. And I think we read a lot about the failures, but it's an attempt to build up an alternate ecosystem outside of the US. And the digital currency is part of that. Trade in terms of the yuan is part of that. 5G obviously is part of it. I think the slowing of 5G build in China, I should have mentioned this, also has slowed the build of the 5G infrastructure in countries that are tied into China. But it's again, it's an attempt to build up an alternate ecosystem to that of the US. And if you grade it on 1 to 10, the overall scores to date probably is a 4, where 10 would be very high. So there are some mixed areas of success, but also mixed areas of, but again, it doesn't mean that they're going to give up. And again, if basically, even though something doesn't work for a while, what they do to keep on doing is basically trying different ways. So again, I don't think we're doing the similar kind of vision. And again, I think if we want to stop China in 5G, we should be having our own 5G ecosystem, and then basically promoting that as an alternate to China. And that's what's made the US successful in the past, by being a leader and then promoting that leadership. Today, we seem we've lost that drive, that ambition, and again, the vision of where are we going? Are we going to become basically infrastructure is good, but what are the employment opportunities for graduates? What industries are we going to grow? What industry to support? And in the past, I was involved with some of the activities in military commercial ecosystem, and some of the stuff was really good. There was some waste, but again, the relationship between military and the commercial environment was much better in the past than it is today from a high-tech point of view.
Last question from a listener asks where Russia fits into this picture.
Yeah, China obviously is relying on Russia for oil and natural gas, but I don't think there's from another perspective, I don't think the relationship is as close as we might think it is, because I think the autocracy or the approach of Russia in terms of its industries is actually quite different from China. So I think it's a relationship of convenience versus high level of strategic value other than oil and natural gas.
With that, Dr. Jones, I want to thank you profoundly for sharing your wisdom and insights with us. I want to thank all of our many viewers. Let me remind you again that you are our support, you viewers. If you haven't subscribed to Asia Times, please do so early and often. Get your friends to, because we rely on our readers and our viewers to support us in this kind of worthwhile effort. With that, with considerable gratitude, I am ready to close the seminar. If you have any last thoughts, Dr. Jones, I'll give you the floor. Otherwise, we can get on to our day.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate the questions. Very, very, very good questions, and I appreciate being able to talk to you. And if there's any other information you want, please let us know. But very, very pleased to be here today. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Dr. Jones. Thank you to all of our participants. We will be going live with the next webinar in a couple of weeks. You'll find the announcement in Asia Times. With that, I wish good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, as the case may be, to all of our viewers, and hope to see you again very soon. And thank you again, Dr. Jones.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good day.